cool.
All right.
Okay, thank you, Ian, for sending us live. Hello, everybody. So it's me, Sam, in the background, joined by Ian as well, Ian Lahart, and the person you can see on your screen is Dr. Thuy-vy Nguyen, who is a very special guest speaker today. We're very excited to have Thuy-vy. One, because she's doing all sorts of interesting research, which we thought we should give a sort of nod to in the opening, but also she started the Durham Right Science Club as well. So please do check out. They've always got really good speakers on there as well. But a few quick announcements before we begin. So one is that we've got plenty more speakers coming up in the Riot Science calendar, and you can check those out on our Twitter handle at Riot Science Club, or our website www.riotscience.co.uk. Hopefully I've got that right. But you can just, probably best place to find us is Twitter. And yes, and of course, all of our recordings, including today's talk, will be put on our YouTube page. So just search Riot Science Club there as well. Okay, so those are the announcements. In terms of like housekeeping, if you do have any questions, please do put them in the chat on the right hand side of your screen, and we will feed them to Thuy-vy at the end of the talk. And if you also want to upvote any questions that you like, we'll also prioritize the most popular as well. Okay, so enough of me. I'll just move on to introducing our speaker today. So I've already said it's Dr. Thuy-vy Nguyen. So Thuy-vy is an assistant professor at the University of Durham in the quantitative social psychology. Her research is mainly focused on looking at solitude, and she does all sorts of weird and wonderful experiments, and one of my favourite ones is where she asks participants to sit quietly by themselves for a period of time, for 15 minutes, and observe how they react to that experience. And if you ever need participants, Thuy-vy, please let me know, because I would like to have 15 minutes of lone time. So she's got a few other things as well that Thuy-vy is interested in, and you can find out her most recent work, actually, which was published not long ago now via the journal Collaborative Psychology, and that too looks very interesting. So Alone with Our Thoughts, investigating of autonomy supportive framing as a driver of enjoyment during quiet time and solitude. Enough of my rambling. So Thuy-vy, I'm going to hand the keys over to you. Thank you again for giving your time today, and the floor is yours.
All right, so thank you for having me. Yeah, thank you for Ian and Sam for having me today. So yeah, again, my name is Thuy-vy Nguyen, and I just gonna give you a brief introduction about who I am. So I like traveling, taking photos. A lot of that gonna come. My experience with traveling and taking photos will come into this presentation today. Well, mostly of flowers and food and just random stuff that I see. And yes, I study solitude. So I began my PhD training in late 2011 at the University of Rochester. It took me 7 years, but I finally finished in 2018, arrived at Durham University in 2019 in my first position as assistant professor in psychology. So now this introduction is only to say that I'm now 10 years into the world of research. And luckily, I have had a lot of time and mentorship to reflect on my program of research and my research identity. And today I will share that reflection with you in this talk. So I titled it An Early Career Researcher Reflection on Programmatic Research. So my journey with solitude started before I started my PhD. When I discovered that there are people on this earth that called researchers that just like to do a shit ton of science stuff on a specific thing. Like some lady would just be studying the black hole, or some guys would just study bees. And the most attractive thing about what they do is that they don't seem to be to have to interact much with anyone aside from just focusing on that one thing that they research on. Like this guy right here, to me, he's like a legit researcher right there, just staring at whatever that cube is. And oh my God, how was I wrong? Because the more I think about it, the more I realize that having a program of research can be just about staring at something long enough, yes. The more you stare at it, you will learn a lot from it, or it can be more than that. So let's start with the questions that we all dread, or at least I dread, at the beginning of our research career, when we first have to introduce ourselves to someone at an academic conference, or when people go around the room in the lab meeting introducing ourselves, and sometimes I'm that unlucky person that have to start first to introduce, and I have no script to go with. So I just go, hi, my name is Thuy-vy, and my research is about solitude. I think there is an optimal level of details that you can give to the other person about your research. If it's too broad and superficial, you might just get an interesting, and then it does not generate much conversation. So how did I go about finding out what my research program is to answer this question informatively? So there's an article in the APS Observer, 10 tips for developing a programmatic line of research. And here are the tips. So I'll give you a few seconds to go through all the items. I think these are pretty achievable items, goals, with the assumption that once you do all of those things, you will somehow develop a program of research. But I'm pretty sure that many of us, me included, probably thinking, well, I do most of these things, but I'm close to the end of my PhD program and I still don't know what my research program is about. So there is a chance. So I think there is a chance that you might have found it, but you haven't had a structured way to think about it. So usually we hear people talk about it in terms of a narrative around our research. So this is very important, specifically when you give a job talk, because the hiring committee wants to see the narrative of your research, which will help them envision your future direction. So let me try a different approach from the author in this article. So let's start with what is programmatic research. It's a systematic step-by-step approach to theory development to make a contribution to the understanding of human thought and behavior. I find this definition clear, and I got this from a paper that by Randolph Singh, 2006. Now, two words that I want to highlight here. So systematic and contribution. So one way to think about systematic approaches, we can think of the two familiar approaches that we have learned. The inductive approach, or bottom-up approach, beginning with making observations, finding consistent patterns in what you observe, which can lead to theorizing about how those patterns come about. And the other approach is the deductive approach, or top-down, starting with an established theoretical framework that guide you to formulate certain hypotheses and test them out. So at the beginning of my research on solitude is mostly inductive. So it started with the paradigm that Sam kind of briefly touched on, where I put participants in a room, take away all their devices, and have them be alone for 15 minutes. And I compared this with another condition where participant has a short back and forth Q&A, get to know you kind of conversation with the research assistant. So after putting participant in the room for 15 minutes to be alone, I observed that for the solitude condition, both positive and negative affect that I measure before and after the 15 minutes period went down. Now, so that was kind of weird for me because I expected that if solitude is such a negative experience like the literature has described, I should see only positive affect go down. But then I thought, well, all of those items tap onto the activating and high arousal types of positive and negative affect. Whereas in emotion literature, affects can be emotions and affects can be categorized based on two dimensions. So valence from positive to negative, and activation from high arousal state to low arousal state. So when I threw in the low arousal emotion items in the subsequent studies after that, after sitting alone with no device and no activity, this time I still see high arousal state drop, but low arousal states, both positive and negative, increase. So from this, I interpreted this as instead of simply changing our positive and negative emotion, the effect of solitude on our current emotion seems to be more about activation level rather than valence. So we call this the deactivation effect. Now, taking an inductive approach by observing the deactivation effect across different conditions of solitude, such as sitting alone with some readings, sitting alone with a smartphone to browse on social media, or with puzzles. So the aim here is empirical generalizations, asking the question, can I observe this phenomenon across a range of conditions? Now let's go back to the definition of programmatic research. So I think the inductive approach with the aim of empirical generalizations is a fine systematic way to build a research program. But I do ask myself time from time, what contribution do I make to the understanding of human thought and behavior? And to me, the one word that I haven't highlighted is theory development. And to me, that's such a big and scary word. How do I make my contribution to the literature through theory development? Okay, so let me shift gear a bit and tell you a little side story of my travel around England. So I was in Oxford earlier this year. I love Oxford, not just because of all the stoneheads with the very amusing facial expressions outside of the Sheldonian Theatre, but because I have had so many great experiences visiting the museum here. And one of the memorable ones were earlier this year. So this exhibitions was on Melancholy, a new anatomy at the Western Library. So I took the photo of the quote that led me to an epiphany while I was in this exhibition. So the whole exhibition, in summary, was about the works of Robert Burton, a scholar in the University of Oxford in the 17th century, who made observations and advice about how to avoid melancholy. I have a hard time pronouncing that word. So melancholy through lifestyle practices like eating certain food, exercising, and then he suggests that moderation is a key for a happier life or a healthier mind. So what led me to the epiphany was how Burton's earlier observations about what food is good for our mind is linked to later discoveries on bidirectional interaction between gut bacteria and nervous system. Now, I don't know if we can say that Robert Burton's observations actually led to the discovery of microbiome and nervous system interaction, but it does tell me that a lot of our observation, especially through empirical generalization, can be useful. Maybe in the future, some hundreds years from now, someone will be able to actually identify the mechanism and explanations for the observations that we make. But the question I have is, how can we focus our observations to add to theory development? So perhaps a better example would be Darwin theory of evolution, which also started with lots and lots of earlier observations that Darwin made about birds during his journey to the Galapagos Islands on the Beagles. So if you're curious about what historians and scholars in the humanities have learned about Darwin's story prior to his theory publication, I highly recommend you to visit the Down House south of London. So my visit to the Down House was also memorable because it gave me some insights into how bottom-up observation can contribute to theory development, and how I can connect this back to how I see works in psychology. So to connect Darwin's theory to psychology, one helpful paper for me was by Olivia Guess and Andrea Martin about theory building models, published in the Perspective on Psychological Science. So Olivia gave a talk on her paper in another RIOTS seminar. I would highly recommend you check out the papers and watch her talk, which I will link in the next slide. I want to say that many people and open science scholars have written on theory building and psychology, but I have found this paper particularly helpful for me. So the papers talks about how we can build theories through specifying our models to generate testable hypotheses. I will not go in depth into the model here, but I would just use Darwin theory of evolution as an example of how I apply that to this model that they proposed. Okay, so keep in mind that Darwin theory is not the only theory of evolution. Actually, we need to specify that, and his theory is about evolution by natural selections, specifically of the fittest, so most suited for their environment. However, what we don't usually hear about is that his theory, of course, in popular media, I'm pretty sure if you're really interested in Darwin, you probably already know all these stories, is that his theory survives through time because many of his descendants and scientists have used mathematical models to specify his theory, to able to make prediction about, for example, cell replication and mutation in the lab. So one of the people that was credited for revived Darwin theory is Ronald Fisher's, the statisticians that we often hear about when through the Fisher's Z transformation. So in psychology, Guess and Martin's paper gave us some example at each level of theory building, suggesting that we need to focus more on being explicit about our theories as well as specifying them with computational modeling. But one line in their papers specifically stuck out to me. So I highlight that in red here. So they suggested that many psychological research that is affected by the replication crisis does not explicitly state their theories. I would go even further to say that the ones who do state their theories are actually not very well specified. So when theory is not well specified, I think we run the risk of not being able to falsify it or refine or make it better. Perhaps that might explain why in flagship journal like Psych Science between 2009 and 2019, there has been a paper publishing to suggesting that there are more than 350 named theories mentioned in the journal. So this finding makes it to the Wikipedia page of psychological science that the majority of research published in this journal was not driven by theory nor contribute to cumulative theory building. So to me, it makes sense that when theory is not well specified and thus cannot be falsified, refined, or improved, this means any set of findings that cannot be traced back to a theory can become a new theory, in quotes, of its own, if the authors, especially if the author have a big enough egos to claim it. Now, I'm not saying this about all the theories in psychology. I think there are some pretty good theories out there. But what I see here is that at least we have 359 names of different theories published in Psych Science. Then, to me, that just simply there's too many of them. To be more specific, basically in social psychology specifically that I have observed, I often see hypotheses that are also usually broadly formulated. So from my experience, I've seen many hypotheses, for example, of interactions that simply say there will be an interaction without specifying the direction of how the interaction would happen. When hypotheses are drawn from a theory, the theory is usually poorly specified and lack framework. So say someone So say someone broadly hypothesizes an interaction, and they get an interaction. That turns into a publication with some interpretation of that interaction. On top of that, we don't know if questionable research practices might also be a part of this process. Because the hypothesis is broadly stated, it's difficult to identify whether the finding truly support or reject the hypothesis. And because the theory is so poorly specified, it is not clear whether the hypothesis supports the theory or calls for it to be refined. So every step tracing back to the higher level is disrupted. And I think right now with the open science reform, we have only focused on this part right here. Okay, so that was a lot, and I'm going to take a moment here to say that I think it's completely fine to take an inductive approach. So we all can be like Robert Burton, making systematic observations with the aim of empirical generalizations without having to think about theory building. In fact, I myself would hesitate to build theory before I make sure that I have done careful and rigorous observations. Before I move on to the next slide, I would like to add a disclaimer here in case we have any humanities people in joining this talk, is that Robert Burton did not say these things. This is just a very bad poem that I made because I was amused that he wrote about pork being four humors, referring to the four humors of ancient medicine. It has nothing to do with pork being funny. Now, so what is the take-home message here about programmatic research? So I would say that it starts with what interests you. So yes, I do think that it starts with finding that one thing that you want to stare at a lot. So ask yourself, what is it that interests me? Especially if you're someone who just started a PhD program. But also ask yourself what approach you are taking with your research. If you're taking a deductive approach, ask yourself what is the framework, the theory you build on, and more importantly, is the theory well specified, and should you specify it before designing a paradigm to formulate your hypotheses? For example, it can come in form of a statement like, if theory X is true, when I create this Y condition, I should be able to observe this and that. Or you can also use computational modeling. So that's something that I would be very excited to look into. If you take an inductive approach, yes, the aim is for empirical generalization, to see systematically, can I observe this phenomenon across a range of conditions? But while doing this, continue to ask yourself if there is a framework or theory that my observations can be tied to. So on top of that, if you are early career researchers like myself, you and I are in a very cool time where we have tools that can help us incorporate feedback of others before, with register report, incorporate feedback of other people before we even run this research study. We can communicate and collaborate with others through sharing data, code, and materials so that we all can work collectively to build theories. So Darwin did not work entirely alone. So usually we always hear a story about the lone geniuses, but Darwin actually sent close to 1,000 of correspondences, and there's a Darwin correspondence project. That's really cool if you want to check that out, about all the letters that he has sent to others. But yeah, he sent all these letters to discuss his observation experiments, to get people's thoughts and feedback before he wrote up his final manuscript. So I want to bring you back to the introduction that we give to each other about a research program. I would suggest building your research program toward the aim where not only can you specify a topic of your interest, but also the framework and theory you study that topic from. So yes, I study solitude, but from what angle? So I can adjust my introduction over time, refine it, And to me, that has been the approach that I've taken to develop and refine my research identity after 10 years of my research career. So I'd like to end this talk and say thank you for attending this seminar today. And I hope this has been helpful in getting you started on refining your research program.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Thuy-vy. That's really, really interesting talk. I wished I'd had this talk before I started my PhD, I have to say. So hopefully that will be very much useful to people who are just setting out now. I do have a couple of questions, and just to say, if any, for those who are attending, if you do have any questions, please do put them in the live Q&A bit, and then I can feed them to Thuy-vy. So one of the things that struck me is that you had quite a long sort of journey to where you are now. So you were saying that sort of over 10 years. I wonder how much can your experience generalize to, say, Europe and particularly the UK, where normally, I mean, the conventional kind of approach is that you, I don't know, you apply for a PhD studentship. The idea isn't necessarily yours, although how it's executed, you can tweak and have autonomy there. And then obviously a PhD never turns out the way that it set out to turn out. And much of that is due to the sort of input from the student. But that will take about 3, maybe 4 years. And then you go on to a postdoc. Again, you don't necessarily have autonomy. So you don't really have autonomy until maybe, oh gosh, maybe 6 or 7 years after you started your PhD. So in that, given that time frame, I mean, would you say that, what does that mean for your experience, and whether you can generalize it to a more UK Europe context?
Yeah, so I think I'm actually in a very lucky and privileged position to be able to do, like, not only have an advisor that allowed me to a lot of autonomy, and also a lot of time. And I'm aware that the North American models, you basically do a PhD 5 years, but it's also normal for people to sometimes take 6 or 7 years to finish their PhD, and that just fine. And but with the UK model, I'm not familiar with the European model, but I'm assuming what your question is similar. Is that with the UK model, from what I know, you start with already applying for the funding and have a specific projects in mind, which to me is great, because a lot of time students in the US, they come in and they do 2 years of master, and that is when you kind of explore and read, and then you don't really have the pressure to have a specific idea at the beginning of your PhD. But perhaps maybe that's a good thing. I think with creativity, we know that time pressures can really undermine that. But with the UK model, I think that during the time that you do the work with your advisor, I wonder if there is a space to even, because I think another observation I see in the UK is that it's more theory driven. The research that I see with the focus more on like cognitive neuro. So I tend to see that my UK colleagues conduct research in more theory driven, because either you study animals from the behavioral framework or other cognitive models. And I think that's actually a strength, because you already come from the position of doing it from a deductive approach. But I think it's still helpful to try to see if you can, whatever theoretical framework you come from, to continue to refine it and then run the experiment. So you already start from the position of having pretty well-refined theories, I would say. Then just go from there and see how you continue doing that. And I think from there, the whole open science reform with sharing data and also pre-registrations and register reports, that allowed you to actually make sure that if you happen to not replicate some paradigm or happen to have something that conflict with certain theories, your research won't just be kicked out and go into the drawer, right? So you'll still be able to put it out there and allow other people to also say it, and allow the theory, whatever theory that you draw your build your research on, can continue to be refined. So yeah, that's a long answer, but I don't know if I actually answer your question. Yeah.
No, that's my fault. I have a nasty habit of asking questions that require a long answer. What I will do is I'll just have a look at some of the questions that have come through. So one thing is, I had a question, Ian. I don't know where it's disappeared to. It was from Nadia, but there was one question from Anonymous, which is, what made you choose solitude as your area of interest?
So I think that is during my master program, when I started realize that I could do research, I just find that the literature on solitude just mainly, I think it's come from the feeling of being unsatisfied with what I read. And I just said, well, there is something more that I can see, because so that is also a very lucky position that there's just not a lot of empirical research on solitude at the time. So, but then the fact that I'm interested in the interdisciplinary literature and read about the humanities and all the things. So what I find interesting is that how much we, as psychology, at least from my area of research, is that I can learn so much from the observations that have been made in the humanities. So there's a lot of writers and historians, or even hermits, that have been written to describe their experience in solitude, in solitary confinement, or when they just go off grid into the world and just be by themselves. And to me, that's a lot of rich qualitative data that I can draw from. And yeah, so from that, then I built my interest and kind of try to see empirically how can I study this. Yeah.
Okay, very good. We found that question from Nadia. So her question is, so a theory may be well specified, but we hear more that many dogmas aren't reproducible / now being debunked. Have you considered how we can build in evidence synthesis and critical appraisal into the programmatic approach, or would this be built into deductive and inductive?
I'm not sure I understand the questions. Yeah.
I guess
okay.
I guess maybe there's a sort of life cycle of that you would probably label a programmatic approach to sort of developing ideas and sort of meticulously criticizing this sort of evidence base, and then move before even beginning to move on to doing research. It's almost like, do you critically appraise the literature before you make your first step? Is probably a better way of me rephrasing the question. So I don't know how you could comment or answer that, really. I suppose because you seem to have taken a kind of a bottom-up approach where you collected the data yourself. But do you think, I guess a better way of asking this question is, do you think that the first step, or one of the first steps, should be to really critically appraise the literature, doing, I don't know, a systematic review or evidence synthesis approach?
Yeah, I definitely think so. And I think that a lot of time, most of us, or I think many students are not allowed to do that, especially, at least from my experience with like the model here with the 3 years, is that you don't have enough time to kind of do the very critical review of all the literatures that have been out there, and also be able to like say, okay, there's just inconsistencies, and identify those. What I see more is the briefly go through the literature and see whatever I can cite to support whatever I want to do, and then quickly wrap up, like put together a study and collect data. I personally have done that myself, so I can't say that I was not vulnerable to that, but I think I do agree that with a more deductive approach, it would be helpful if we could have the time to kind of like review all the evidence out there, either through systematic review, through meta-analysis, and then, yeah, so that we can have a big pictures of what's out there. I want to add to is that what annoying thing that I also see is that when you study certain topic and there's just so many, I think it's difficult I can see that it's difficult for the students if you're particularly studying a literature with a lot of inconsistencies of people saying different things, but they don't particularly disagree with one another. It's almost they talk over each other. And then you can't decide for yourself what exactly is the direction. So yeah. So
No,
I sympathize with that.
Yeah, totally. That you voiced exactly my frustration when I was doing my PhD, which was you don't know who to believe and you don't know who to side with, and a couple of things that I think that just again gives even more motivation for why you would do a systematic review or evidence synthesis, because then you can at least cover yourself by saying, well, this is a systematic appraisal, and show in kind of the light of day that there are so many different inconsistencies. The other thing as well, which has just escaped my mind, I forgot what I was going to say. Anyway, what I was going to ask is, before, because Ian's just posted a question, what I wanted to ask quickly is I just wanted to dig a little deeper about the inductive approach that you mentioned. So I don't know whether you remember the exchange between Tal Yarkoni and Daniel Larkins a few years ago. So Tal, it might be something for you to look at. So Tal published a paper called The Generalizability Crisis, and he very much grounds psychology in this sort of inductive reasoning tradition, and how you develop your theories and test them. However, Larkins was very much of the solid contrast of view of saying, no, actually the deductive approach is the dominant approach for inferential statistics in psychology, basically just gradually killing off theories through significance tests. I'm kind of interested to know what your thoughts are, because I guess Tal's view, the inductive view, would be that you would really need to specify in quite precise terms exactly the theory that you're testing, whereas it's not necessarily the case for deductive. I might be completely mischaracterizing the whole debate here, but it seems with a deductive approach, it's more a case of it's a given that you can't really pre-specify absolutely everything for a theory, because that's not feasible, but it's enough for you to have a vague idea, you test it, and then, but again, apologies if I completely mischaracterized that discussion. So yeah, my question is, what do you think?
No, well, I think that that's why I think, because I think I'm aware of that, and I was actually confused too, because for a while I thought I was doing deductive, because if you have a hypothesis and you test it, right? So to me, that's deductive. But I think that's why the model that I presented earlier was kind of, at least for me, it was helpful. Maybe I just go back to that model. Yeah. So like, to me, it depends on what level you are talking about. And you can start with just hypothesis, and then you can have data. And I think what Daniel Lacan was talking about is that this step right here, that we use the null hypothesis testing to kind of just come up with hypothesis and use data to test hypothesis, was questionable to me whether or not sometimes even they are testing the hypothesis, as I think if the hypotheses are too broad, as I think, I'm not sure if you're aware of one of the paper, I think by wagon maker, the guy who built Jeffs, how they try to code different pre-registration and they couldn't even identify the hypotheses, like what are the hypotheses in this pre-registration. And so I think if I understand the debate correctly, as you described, is that I think Daniel might talk about it right here, whereas for Tao, right here, that would just be inductive. And I wonder if they actually agree without I wonder if that they actually agree with each other.
I don't think they do. I think they violently disagree.
I see.
Yeah, I think it's more a case of they see. I mean, I won't rehash the debate, and in fact, we did get Tal to do a talk on his paper. So if people do want to look at it, I did invite Daniel to talk about it, but he was sort of done with the whole debate. So that gives you an idea of how exhausting and unresolved it is. I think it was more a case of. It seemed to me one schism in their argument was the sort of issue with falsifiability. Have you articulated your hypothesis in a way that it can be falsified, which I think is sort of what Wagon Makers is looking at, and what a chronic issue in psychology generally is, versus, you know, what would look like a testable hypothesis, and what is that? What are the limits to the inferences that one can make? And then that's when you get into the murky world of the inductive approach versus the deductive approach. It seems to me that it seemed, at least Daniel's point was more to do with that to take an inductive approach is to have like a very exhaustive hypothesis, very comprehensive, which is so computationally intensive that it's kind of almost bordering meaninglessness, versus a deductive approach, which is aware of the limitations of the inferences that one can make, but at least it kind of narrows it down further by just systematically testing the kind of research question space, if you like, and this just sort of crossing off the list what we think is likely true and what is not, you know, and that kind of almost like a process of elimination. But yeah, go on.
Do you think that the fact that they're talking about by being very almost humble about our inference, is that the specification step?
Yeah, because I mean, yeah, the context of it is that it's based on Tal's paper about the generalizability crisis.
Yeah.
So it's sort of, what do we do with what we find? And Tal is very keen on having like a he's very much focused on the sort of computational side, which is obviously in the spirit of Olivia Guest as well. But if I can sort of change gear and get us out of the weeds, because I would commend any, you know, the work by Tal and Daniel as well. And I don't know which side is correct, and I'm sure it's one of those things that it's necessarily unresolvable because it keeps conversation going. But whilst we're on that slide, Ian does bring up one question, which is, have you seen any evidence of questionable research practices in solitude research? And if so, how do you think they have influenced some of the accepted wisdom in the area?
Well, so, I mean, so my position is never to, I personally don't choose the position of kind of calling people out like publicly. I do think that we can, you know, just exchange email and let teacher know, hey, this is what I see, and you know, and then people would over time. I do think that we all over time just kind of be reasonable and correct ourselves. So one issues that I've experienced in the literature is this thing called, which I have heard people talk about in the term like salami slicing, where there's the one set of data and how it become multiple publications. So I did have an exchange with an editor about that, and to let the author know that if they do publish from the same data set, please specifically say that in the second manuscript so that people can at least have the paper trails of the finding coming from the same data set. And that was actually turned out to be quite a constructive experience from my experience, because we later on, me and the author, we met, and then and I think just potentially going to become collaborators. So I do think that we can. So yes, so I think that's one issue of the literature. Another issue is more something I mentioned specifically here, is that sometimes, because there's one big thing in solitude, is the issues about autonomy and choice. So that chosen solitude is more positive and better, and so, and then one of the research method that people often use is experience sampling, EMA method, and that can give you a lot of data. And a lot of time I see the practice of putting two-way and three-way interaction. So to me, I'm allergic to three-way interaction. When I see that, I just start sweating. And but I and then you see that throughout multiple outcomes, if you see that the p-values is just around less than 0.05, so we already know that that's to me, that's something that would make me question whether or not to build my research based on that finding, especially if it's the close to 0.00, close to 0.05, and it's a three-way interaction. Yeah, so that's two issues. So one is salamis-lysing, and the other one is unspecified interactions and multiple level interactions. Yeah.
Wonderful. There was a more of a comment than a question from Anonymous, which is there was a cool preprint by Fife and Rogers in 2019, who argued a lot of psychology research can be classed as a rough confirmatory data analysis, where people test weak hypotheses using methods designed for confirmatory tests. And it sort of relates to our discussion on inductive and deductive reasoning, I guess. So that's obviously one on the reading list. So I don't see any more new questions coming in, and I'll just check if there's any on social media. So I guess one question which struck me, I think, at the beginning of your sort of your talk, and I think it's a sort of a general lesson I kind of got from your talk, which is developing your own kind of research identity takes time. And I suppose this goes back to my initial question about the time frames in which we operate don't necessarily lend itself to this sort of gradual development of your research identity. What sort of top tips would you recommend to sort of early career researchers in terms of what they should dedicate their time to, that would allow them to sort of move quite agilely between different possible routes that they might want to pursue? And it could be, you know, advice about certain skills that you found interesting, or in terms of where they choose to go and who to work with and stuff, sort of practical advice that would have a universal application, I guess, because I think you've got quite a broad background, I think, and that would be quite useful to learn lessons from.
Yeah, so if specifically, I think, yeah, with my background, I think it would be hard to kind of give an advice that would work for everyone, because one of the cliche that we usually fall into is that just follow your heart. Yeah, but we also have limited time. Oh, you can hear my dog in the background. So I hope that's not too disrupted. Okay, so yeah, so I think I think at the beginning is probably, to me, that I have observed in other early career researchers, it's probably at the beginning, you know, people are confused in what direction they want to go, depending on how long your PhD is, whether or not it's 3 years, 5 years, 7 years. I think toward maybe if 3 years, I think toward the end of 2 years, that's where I think it's good. It's a healthy practice to start asking what I want to do and where I want to go. And when I hear you mention different routes, I assume that you also open to the possibility of non-academic route. I think that if you go to the academic route, maybe your supervisor will be the most helpful sources for you, or not, and sometime. So that's another thing, is that if you ask me advice on before choosing supervisor, that's also another information, not just about their publication record, their productivity, whether or not they are big name supervisor or not, but also try to learn about the research culture in their lab from their previous students, from their previous supervisees, and get a feel of what they, what the research culture in their lab. I just want to say that my dog is okay. He's okay. He's just, there's a vacuum going outside and he doesn't like it. But for those who want to go into non-academic route, at least for me, I did explore that in like 3 months at kind of like a consulting firm. And I have found that my experience with experimentations, running experimental design, and also data analysis have been pretty useful, at least value in that context. And so in that context, I think there's certain skills. So if around the 2nd year and you decide that maybe academia not for you, I think would focus more on building skills. So coding, data analysis, and also any research design. And I want to warn that if you're lucky enough to find the firm that actually value you, like actually hire PhD because they value PhD, because there are also consulting firms right there who just want to hire PhD for the degree, and simply you go in there and they just say, no, we just do what I say. So it really depends on the firms and the organization that you end up with. Another skills that I have learned recently through a PhD graduate that go into nonprofit, is that she helps me a lot in terms of refine my research language to communicate to the communities that her nonprofit is serving. So I think that that's another skills if you want to go into a nonprofit and want to kind of do more of like a community kind of based kind of research, and then I think specifically helpful is the skills to basically talk about a research that lay people can understand. I think that's a huge skill that I myself continue to build as well, because she gave me a lot of feedback on my information letters for ethics, because a lot of the language we use doesn't resonate with people. And then other things is I see a lot of data visualization. I know that we use a lot of data visualizations in research, but the data visualization that speak for a lay audience is different. So if that's something that you want to go into, I would look into that. Like you already have the skills and the strength in terms of research design and data analysis. I'm sure of that. Like you already have that training. Build the other skills that your program might not specifically help you with, by, like, if you want to go outside, learn how to communicate your research to non-academic. In fact, I think if you want to stay in academia, that skill is very useful for grant writing. I have found that very useful for my grant writing. So,
very good. I could finish it there, but somebody asked me to ask you this actually. One of the kind of things that I found out relatively recently in the past couple of years is that grant panels, they tend to like to see independence in your research, and they can give a sort of selective advantage to those people who go on to publish papers where their former PI, whether it's PhD supervisor or postdoc supervisor, where their former PI is not an author on that paper. So it shows that they have sort of basically flown the nest and become their own standalone researcher, which for me came at a bit of a shock because, you know, I've spent quite a bit of time investing my time with collaborating with this individual, and I would have expected it to yield quite a few papers even after I had left, and maybe even help me shape my career within that field. Only then to be told that, well, this actually is can work against you. So I don't know what your thoughts on that, whether you've also seen or experienced this, and yeah, just what your general thoughts are.
I think unfortunately that is a heuristic that I think I have heard too about grant panels. Is I think yeah, both from North America and also well, in the UK, I think there's specific early career focus grant that you can
yeah,
at
but like
least
the ESRC one is,
yeah, ESRC that you can have a document that you can use to explain like why. That's something that I appreciate in the UK context, is that you can explain, like if you take a few years off, you can explain that. If you have publications, you can explain that. Because I think particularly, for example, I have tried to use the credit taxonomy to explain my independence and explain that, okay, a lot of this work is I go from conceptualization, and then my advisor or my collaborator mainly help me with revision and kind of like refine the work. So I think that's one way that you can use it. I actually use it in my CV when because at my institution we submit we kind of just submit every year for promotion, and whether or not you get promoted or not, that's depend on the school. But I think in there I do use like credit taxonomy to explain how many percentage is my work, and I can't see why that can't be used in grant application, because with the ESCC you submit, like for the early career one, you submit a 2-page CV. So I can't see why you can't use that and kind of just have for me, I just use a parentheses and what is the, conceptualization and design, Thuy-vy, and then someone else, what do they do? And you can put a percentage on that as well. So yeah, but unfortunately, I think the independence heuristic is there. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point about the credit. I think that's a really nice way to sort of transparently show the level of involvement from supervisors, whether formally or current. You could also add, I guess, it's also a good thing for you to bear in mind in terms of what you prioritize. Of course, say, for example, a postdoc, they should prioritize the work that they're getting paid for, but they shouldn't just focus. That shouldn't be the only thing they might. With this knowledge, I think at the time I would have been more encouraged to collaborate more outside of my group, and to seek out those kind of external collaborators to sort of set the seedbed for collaborations after my postdoc. And I think I kind of regret that. So yeah, and Nadia also said it was a good idea to use credit. So now we're at the 3 o'clock mark. I think we can call time. Thank you so much, Thuy-vy, for giving a really, really nice insight into how to structure your sort of independent research identity, if you like. And thanks, Ian, for co-hosting. I guess The next talk will be, I believe, next week. I can't remember where it will be, but do take a look at our Twitter feed and our webpage. As I said, they gave the links in the start of the talk. Thuy-vy, thank you so much again. And if you want to stay on after we've closed this session, and we can just quickly debrief. Okay. Thank you, everybody.